crusader with respect to dealing with and providing assistance and fighting for communities of color and those that join her and just join in the national movement. She served as the first female chair of the National Environmental Justice Advisory Council, NEJAC, to the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, and was co-chair of the Northeast Environmental Justice Network. She's a former member of the National Advisory Environmental Health Sciences Council, the National Institute of Health, and a member of the Environmental Justice Advisory Committee to the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation. She also serves on the Institute of Medicine's Committee of Ethics of Housing-Related Health Hazards Research involving children's youth. She received the Dean's Distinguished Award in 2004 from the Columbia Mailman School of Public Health and is the recipient of the 10th Annual Heinz Award for the Environment. She also erased the statement made by the Nobel Committee in 2004 about Wangari Maathai, the laureate for 2004, and they said, "Peace on earth depends on our ability to secure our living environment. A holistic approach to sustainable development that embraces democracy, human rights, and sustainable development and women's rights. She thinks globally, and she acts locally." And Dr. King embraced that holistic approach that democracy, human rights, civil rights, and peace are intrinsic and entwined. Dr. King also said that in any nonviolent campaign, there are 4 basic steps. The first is collection of the facts to determine where injustice exists. The second is negotiation. A third, self-purification. And a fourth, direct action. And in a similar vein, the Nobel Committee hailed Wangari Maathai's linkage of science, social commitment, and active politics, as Dr. King did as well. So I would argue that the National Environmental Justice Movement has studiously taken these steps. Now, we still have a very long way to go on the self-purification process, but we are striving to achieve equity, justice, and to empower residents to enter the arena of political decision-making proactively fortified with data, confidence, and a vision of community sustainability. I would also say that Dr. Maathai's activism, excuse me for a minute, for me and my community, Martin Luther King Day is a very special day because it is the day in 1988 that my organization and 200 residents of West Harlem took a direct action that would change our lives, our community's destiny, and would really launch the concept and perspective of environmental justice to the agenda of our state and our city. And with the help of all of our compañeros around this country, we have helped place the agenda of environmental justice and that perspective at the federal forefront. I would also say that we have elevated this perspective and that we've elevated the perspective to the nation, and in a little while I will talk about some of the legislative initiatives that I think we've been able to accomplish. But I believe that exemplary governance is possible when ordinary citizens, just all of us, every one of us, are informed, sensitized, mobilized, and involved in direct action for their environment. And so many of us have become frontline warriors. As Bob Bullard, who I think kicked off this lecture series, would say, we are frontline warriors. And there is an intrinsic relationship between peace and environment. And Dr. King had begun to shift his focus to war and peace because wars are fought over resources. Resources that are becoming scarce because we have not managed them sustainably. So we continue to have conflict at many levels, and there are many levels of oppression. Cesar Chavez fought for the rights and health of farm workers. Ken Saro-Wiwa, was executed for leading the struggle of the Ogoni people in Nigeria 10 years ago against the violence and oil exploitation by Shell Oil and the corrupt Nigerian government. Chico Mendez is imprisoned in Mexico for defending by timber companies. Margie Joseph of Norco, Louisiana, saw many family members die before her activism achieved the relocation of her community from the chemical pollution of next-door oil refineries. Frontline warriors are not just overseas. They are here looking for your support, our support in small towns, reservations, decaying industrial towns, and overburdened, stressed urban neighborhoods. And so I'd like to give you an idea of what the environmental justice movement has been doing over the years to accomplish some of its objectives and goals. We often say, and I'm sure Dr. Bullitt says to you, in 1982, when those 500 folks, African Americans, were arrested in Warren County, North Carolina, they were protesting the dumping of PCBs that were contaminated in soil in a low-income African American community. And they termed the phrase environmental racism. And a lot of people say, well, why racism? Isn't it really income? But they turned that coin because the protesters viewed this action of citing this PCB facility in their community as just another extension of racism that they had experienced in housing, employment, education, city services, and law enforcement. And then in 1986, something very important happened. The first data collection. United Church of Christ published Toxic Waste and Race, documenting that 3 out of 5 African Americans and Latinos live in communities with unregulated toxic waste sites, and that race was the primary predictor of where these sites were located, and low income was the secondary predictor. A seminal moment happened in 1991, and I was very happy to have been part of that. It certainly changed my life. It was a grassroots mobilization that culminated in a summit in Washington, D.C. There were 300 of us people of color delegates and 1,000 participants from grassroots, major environmental justice organizations, foundations, and government. And we all came together to found 17 principles of environmental justice that have been the foundation of our activism. We recognized that we had a commonality, all of us working in our own little towns, villages, large cities, working in our neighborhoods, feeling we're alone, that this couldn't be happening anywhere else. And we found a commonality in that summit, that we were all in the same boat and that we all had to work together to achieve and develop new objectives for the movement. And our mandate was not to develop a centralized voice, because the mantra was, we speak for ourselves. The mandate was to go back and build our base at the grassroots. So we've worked with very little resources and very little capacity to force government accountability. The EPA issued an environmental equity report, and the amusing thing about that was that we got a document undercover that the media had found, and it talked about, who are these untraditional people? This would be dangerous if they were to, hook up with the religious community or labor community, and, how are we going to deal with this, and what are their demands? And so they issued that first environmental equity report that really began to set the EPA on its ear. And then a number of other very important protections happened. Protections for farm workers. Environmental justice delegates and activists realized that these issues are not just national issues. We export our waste and our pollution to other countries, to the third world, to developing nations, and that we need to be part of the global world because globalization is impacting all of us. and certainly many in underdeveloped countries in very dire ways. And so we went to the Rio Earth Summit and have gone to summits in Johannesburg, the World Summit on Sustainable Development, the Conference on Racism, again, to ensure that the United Nations begins to understand that environmental justice is a human rights issue here in the United States as well. And of course, you heard Edith mention the NEJAC, and that was established shortly after in 1993. It was very important when President Clinton issued an executive order on environmental justice because it directed all of the relevant agencies that had anything to do with environment to develop new policies and procedures to address the disproportionate burden of pollution. And what was so important about that order was that for the first time, there was an admission that there is a disparate burden of pollution in certain communities and that contributes to an egregious disparity in health. So another very important meeting happened actually the same day that President Clinton signed the executive order. And that was the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences hosted a symposium on health research and needs to ensure environmental justice. And EJ advocates came together with scientists, and they agreed on the critical need to begin to address the disparate environmental exposures leading to health disparities. And over the years, there have been numbers of more protective rules that incorporate environmental justice into environmental review requirements. First time we had an instance where a community was relocated, an African-American community was relocated from a very egregious facility that was making everyone sick. And because of the National Environmental Justice Advisory Council, we were able to advocate and have access to the EPA to hear our voice and to make that happen. And let me just say how important that is. It wasn't until the NEJAC was created that activists realized that the federal government, that just the EPA itself had over 20 or so federal advisory committees. And all kinds of business people, environmentalists, others were on these committees helping to establish policy. And no people of color had been parts of these until NEJAC. And so, again, even though being on a government work group does not always achieve our objectives, it is an opportunity to have access to the halls of power and to have your voice heard and to begin to understand how business is actually done. So people of color, by the millions, live and work in polluted environments. We bear the brunt of the nation's pollution problem. Exposures and health risks are greater. And inequitable environmental enforcement of environmental laws is a key problem. We believe that it is a human right to have access to clean air, clean water, environmentally safe schools. So many of our young kids are actually being sickened in school where pesticides are being applied, where there's peeling paint and they're getting lead poison, where there's asbestos in the air from improper construction. So environmentally safe schools are very important, clean workplaces and open space. When we talk about environmental racism, we're talking about a civil rights analysis of how environmental decisions are made. And we're talking about discrimination in the enforcement of laws. In some cases, we've gotten memorandum from corporations that talk about the deliberate targeting of certain communities for toxic waste or polluting facilities because those communities are less powerful and less informed about those facilities. So the problem is not simply local or national, it is also global, as we know. Now, few of the more than 400 groups that are working nationally, that are led by people of color, receive any government or foundation funding. Many of them are all volunteer organizations. Most of them are very small. And my organization is one of the largest, and we generally have about 13 to 17 people on staff. And that's pretty small, but that's one of the larger organizations. Environmental justice receives less than 0.5% of all environmental funding, and that has been documented in a study by a professor at Northeastern University. And interestingly enough, mostly women have emerged as grassroots leaders. They may not be the heads of the networks, but you did hear that I was the first woman head of the National Environmental Justice Advisory Council, because we still have gender issues. But they are the ones who understand their community is threatened and begin to take action. And I think it was very interesting that if you look between 2003 and 2005, some of the major environmental awards in this country have gone to African American women. Margie Joseph of Norco received the Goldman Award. I received a Heinz Award. Wangari Maathai received the Nobel Peace Prize. And still, when you pick up a magazine and you look at Vanity Fair's magazine about green environmentalists, you don't see any of those understanding the linkages between environment, human rights, and civil rights. We have a number of regional networks. Again, the idea was to leave the Northeast Environmental Justice Network, and so I work with groups here in Connecticut, up in Boston, and throughout, from about Boston to Washington, D.C. And we've been able to develop common issues around air pollution, around diesel buses, and we've been able to develop strong campaigns that have a stronger voice by working together regionally. I think that, someone asked me earlier, what have been some of the achievements of the movement? And so I've tried to talk about our government accountability and some of the legislation that we've been able to encourage. But we've developed strong campaign and organizing skills. And those campaigns are a permanent vehicle for organizing the grassroots, identifying and building the capacity of local groups and local residents in order to educate them to participate in decision-making in their own communities. The environmental justice framework is built on the 17 principles of environmental justice that are wonderfully posted throughout this museum. But certainly it's a framework that challenges the status quo of the way we now conduct environmental protection. We seek to prevent environmental threats before they occur, prevention. And we support the precautionary principle approach that says, if there's any doubt, we've got hundreds of chemicals, 500-600 chemicals. Are you aware that no more than 30 or so of them have ever been tested before they've been put on the market? We believe there should be a precautionary approach and that it should be in the realm of the pharmaceutical companies or the manufacturers to document that their product is safe, not for us to be the guinea pigs or the canary in the mine, and then to begin to take action after there's a problem. And we've also worked to incorporate other social movements. A lot of people, I testified at a civil rights commission, the Federal Civil Rights Commission, and one of the questions I was asked was, well, gee, can't you just tell me about 1 or 2 or 3 issues that are really the priority ones? It just seems to be so interdisciplinary, so many issues that you're involved in, that it's hard for people to focus and understand what you're about. And part of that reason is because environment is so linked to our security, it's so linked to our quality of life and human health, and the health of our wildlife as well, that we do believe we've got to reach out to people in the housing world, the planning world, that we've got to look at cleaner production, and that we've got to look at public health and sanitation and a variety of issues in order to develop sustainable communities. So again, we believe that the public health model of prevention is a preferred strategy, and the way that most environmental justice organizations have been successful is to translate environmental concerns as public health impacts. And again, if you live in the kinds of communities that are disproportionately burdened, believe me, there are environmental exposures and public health impacts every day. So So again, issues are linked, and I'll just run down some of the issues that we look at as important ones to the EJ movement. Certainly, we begin with human and civil rights, looking at the way laws are enforced, looking at land rights and sovereignty for Native Americans and indigenous peoples, looking at globalization, and a newer issue, food security, which you should be reading quite a lot about. Children's environmental health, looking at the escalating rates of asthma, and those rates are certainly high all over the Northeast, and in East Harlem, in one of our communities, they are the highest in the country. And we continue to be plagued by lead poisoning, as well as pesticide poisoning, which is not something we think about so much because we think about pesticides as more of a rural or farm application. But what you might be surprised to learn is that the highest tonnage of pesticides in New York State, which is a farm state, that are applied in New York City. Applied in New York City, in parks, in public housing projects, and then we have regular folks like us applying them ourselves in our apartments with those spray cans. And we are giving ourselves a very bad environmental exposure that we now, through a variety of research projects going on at the Columbia School of Public Health, we now know that the pesticide impact can lead to developmental delays and lower birth weight in our children. And again, lower birth weight means that you're not starting out, you're not getting a healthy start, and you are much more liable to have other developmental problems and nutritional deficits later in life. That will hurt your attainment of your educational goals. So we also collaborate with untraditional allies. We reach out to labor, to occupational health and safety folks. We work on transportation equity projects and sustainable development.